I think we are ready for my favorite part of the banquet. It really seems so strange to be sitting here at home, you know, talking about this being about to happen. And I'm so pleased that the person who is here to deliver our keynote address is the person he is. As we've talked about a couple times, past President Marc Maurer and I are contemporaries. Actually, we're only a few months apart in age. And we've been going this journey for quite some time. He taking a much more public path than I have, but we have worked on a lot of things together. He has been around and available for a lot of the times in my life when things have been difficult. Also, some of the times that have been most joyous. And one of the things I have appreciated about him throughout the years is the internal joy that comes from him. I don't know how else to put it. It's a kind of a calm, always present, at the heart kind of presence that he brings to life. And I think it has helped us many times as an organization, and certainly has helped me personally. And it is, you know, there are a lot of things that that he has done. And I know that we have the bio on our website, and so I won't go through the list of accomplishments and things that have been there. I think that one of the things I remember when he came here at one of our past conventions, it was the one in 1989, I believe. Is that when we went to York? Yeah. That was the year that my first husband had died of a sudden heart attack. And I remember we were going to leave that convention and the van wouldn't start. But he got in it and he did something and he told us what we needed to do, and we couldn't have lunch with him that day as we were planning to, because he said we needed to get straight back to Lincoln. But it just was, you know, it was so exciting. And one of the cool things that did, in addition to getting the car, the band going so we could get back, was that it caused a discussion to happen on the way back about blind people having all kinds of things that, you know, that we could do. And, you know, it was a beautiful thing. And so without any further rambling on my part, for our keynote address this evening, I'm very, very happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Marc Maurer.
Well, I appreciate very much being here. I've been to a good many banquets in Nebraska, and I have been to Nebraska when there were joyous times to celebrate, and Barbara and I have celebrated together, and also when there were many sadnesses to contemplate and to find a way to internalize so that we could continue to build. And I remember those times.
Yes, sir.
I had forgotten the part about the van. I presume it was the question of hitting the neutral start switch, which is a problem that those vans used to have. I haven't heard of it lately, but if you didn't get precisely in the right position on the shifting lever, the van wouldn't start. Sometimes if you'd wiggle it a little, it would. And sometimes you had to move it out of park and put it into neutral to get the van to start because the lever turned on a switch that would engage the starting switch. And I had encountered this in the past, and consequently we tried it and it did work. It happened to me more than once on the road, although it hasn't happened in a long time and I'd neglected to remember. I've been to a number of conventions in Nebraska, and I know that the football game is over. Oh. I know that the football game did not have the result in it that we had in mind, but it is over. On the other hand, I remember being at banquets in Nebraska when the football game was not over. And I remember that there was a good deal of very, very quiet cheering going on in the room, and I would wonder what was happening, and it sounded like somebody's radio. And as a matter of fact, right next to me on the podium, the president had something in her ear and she was listening to the football game. And I knew that we would get to the banquet speech by and by. I was hoping it wouldn't be interrupted by too many touchdowns. And if there were touchdowns, I was hoping they'd be on the right side. So it isn't that I'm unfamiliar with these football games, Barbara. And it isn't that I'm unfamiliar with your interest in them. I'm aware of it. Maybe next week it'll be a better game. I hope so. I'm all for Big Red, unless of course they're playing the Fighting Irish, in which case I can't help you there. It doesn't happen very often, but it sometimes does. 50 years ago, 1971, I was remarking this to some part of the group gathered there the other night. I had been in the Federation for 2 years, and I took my first trip to travel on behalf of the Federation. By that time, I was in the student division. I was a sophomore in college. And in the spring, when we were having spring break, I went to New Mexico to rustle up students to be part of our student division there. And I met our president in New Mexico. And if I remember right, it was Pauline Gomez, who was a teacher. She had gotten a teaching degree either in the late 1950s or the early 1960s, something like that. Ellen Ringling has joined the meeting. So she'd been a teacher for a decade or so. She'd had trouble finding a teaching job, and eventually she set up her own school and taught children who were in kindergarten, maybe a little in the first grade. I don't remember precisely, but very young children. And she was extremely successful at it. She was sufficiently successful that there was always a waiting list for children to get into her school. And she was doing that as her own business in the early 1960s, when almost nobody in the world who was blind was teaching. There were very, very few people who did. You had a woman named Dr. Grant out of California who did. She had been a teacher before she became blind, and when she became blind, she had been such a very good teacher that she learned some blindness techniques, and her students insisted that she stay a teacher. But except for extraordinary people like that, almost nobody taught. And Pauline was showing the way. So I went to New Mexico and I started working on getting students into the student division. And that summer, I sought the presidency of the student division, and I was elected to be the second president of the student division, and I served in that position for 6 years. I was telling some of our colleagues that when you go to Las Vegas, New Mexico, this is not the same as Las Vegas, Nevada now. Las Vegas, New Mexico is a tiny little place, and I happened to get there riding on a Greyhound bus, and I got off the bus at about 2:30 in the morning, and the bus station was right next to a telephone booth sitting on the corner, and the bus driver said that there wasn't any building, and that if I wanted to find a taxi or something, here was a telephone right here, and I could call information and find out if there was a taxi company in town. And I did find out there was a taxi company in town. I think there were 2 taxis in town, and I woke the guy up who came to get me, and I asked him if there was a hotel, and he showed me the only hotel that was in downtown Las Vegas, New Mexico, and the price tag for the room there that night was $3.75. So this was my introduction to the magnificence of travel on behalf of the National Federation of the Blind. I spent about a week in New Mexico, and I found a bunch of students, and I met a blind professor who was teaching at the University of New Mexico. And I got some people to become a part of the student division in New Mexico, and later some of them came to our national convention and participated in some of the student activities that we had at the national level. Student division was our first division in the Federation. We didn't have divisions before that. Our student division was created in 1967. Jim Gasha was our first president, and I became our second president. Now, that's one thing that happened in 1971. In 1971, this is our golden anniversary convention here, 50 years together, and the 50-year anniversary is the golden anniversary. Gold in 1971 was pegged to $35 an ounce, and the president declared that we would no longer honor the $35 an ounce price for gold. So gold for the first time was let to float. Using gold as coinage in the United States had stopped in 1933, but in 1971, the fixed price for gold ceased to be a part of the monetary system in the United States. That meant that we were effectively off the gold standard. Gold today is trading at a little over $1,900 an ounce. So you see, in 50 years, some things do change. We live in this world that has the technology that is in it. And in this world, we expect and require this technology to serve our needs. Does it serve our needs well enough? No, it doesn't. We sue people all the time about it. We demand that we get equal access to information. In 1971, the technology that was most frequently used by the blind, aside from possibly a Braille slate and stylus, they were fairly easy to come by in 1971. But the technology that we used was a telephone, and it was the kind that had a cord. You couldn't carry it around with you, and you couldn't get on the internet with it. Although there were certain elements of the internet that had been invented by then, mostly it hadn't been. And the internet didn't become a matter that got to be in general use until the 1990s. Although some parts of the scientific community, and especially in secret government agencies, had a variant of it, or at least the inklings of a variant of it. And so we called people, we called each other, and we talked on the phone. We didn't send a text message. There weren't any text messages. And you got so that you could carry around in your head a vast quantity of telephone numbers. There was a story that we were going to run out of names and that everybody would be given a number. And of course, the Social Security numbers that have been given out for ever so long, some people thought we would all divert to having our Social Security numbers be the identifying element of our lives. But blind people knew hundreds of telephone numbers, and you could call them up without having to look them up or think about it, because that's the way we got in touch with one another. So I went to New Mexico and started calling people. I went to a hotel room and called people up, and I looked first on the records of the National Federation of the Blind to find out who we knew who were students in town, and I talked to some of the people in town who had been acquainted with students in New Mexico, and then I called them all and invited them to let me tell them about the Federation, and some of them joined. So that's how we came to build the Federation in those days. And it still works, although there are many more tools than there used to be. In the 1970s, the computer was coming to be known. In universities, you could take computer classes, and in 1970, I took one. Now, it had computer cards that you punched little messages into to get the information into the computer and to figure out how to get the computer program printout that would tell you what the results were for your calculation. It was very clumsy to use, and I didn't know whether the computer was going to be a major factor in my life. So although I could do it, I wasn't fascinated by it. I was studying engineering at the time. But some of my colleagues in the Federation, noticeably Curtis Chong, he decided that he didn't like the output that came out on a sheet of paper that was printed out on a computer printer. So he got a hold of a computer printer that printed on paper tape, and he created a program that would hit the paper tape with periods at different spaces on the tape. And he created a program that would make Braille on a paper tape, and he could take the paper tape out of the computer printer and read the Braille back. At least he could read some of the output of the computer using a Braille system that he invented. And in order to get the paper tape to take the impressions of the periods, he had to put a piece of elastic under the paper. That was our first foray into developing access technology for the blind. During the period of the 1970s and into the 1980s, we worked to develop lots of different computer systems. And by the time we got into the 80s, what we were saying to all the computer manufacturers is, we want to be able to get the information out of your computers. And by the middle of the 1980s, we had mostly solved this problem. We were using the DOS system in those days, the disk operating system as it was known, and it had characters. It had 255 different characters. And so all you had to do was match the character set with Braille symbols, or a set of symbols that you could then turn into voice. We ran a contest for building a system that would take the information off the back end of a computer and run it through a box that would take those 255 symbols and organize them into words and then speak it. And we named this thing the Spequalizer. There were some speech programs that had been invented before we got that far, but this was a universal speech program, and it was the first universal speech program that was used on computers. And that gave us the idea that if we stuck with it, we could help to invent things. In the middle of the 1970s, we also helped with the development, as Michael Hinkson was saying yesterday, of the Kurzweil reading machine, which would take print and make it verbal. Ray Kurzweil sold this product for $40 million. He sold the company that owned the product to the Xerox company and made himself a bunch of money out of it. And then thought to himself, if you can take a bunch of words that are on paper, and if you can turn them into speech, surely you can take speech and turn it into words. So he did that, and he developed the first of the dictation systems that has now come to be part of the Dragon Dictate programs that are used all over the world. He developed the first one for doctors. He said that doctors' handwriting is always awful, and if they would just dictate their information into the computer, then they could get printouts, and that would mean that they could get clean dictated text that would be much easier to read than the chicken scratch they used when they were trying to write out their notes for diagnosis and like that. And he sold that company for a comparable amount of money. So he found out that being associated with the blind was really useful. And he helps to tell the story that one of the things you want to do if you're going to invent a great product, you want to get the people who are going to use it. Get them to tell you what it's supposed to do. And once they've told you what it's supposed to do, then write the advertising copy. Because if you know what your objective is, it's much easier to build it. And if you ask the people who need it, they'll tell you how to do it. And he's invented and sold in the course of his lifetime 11 different companies using this same technique. Now he's working on artificial intelligence for Google, and sometimes we talk to him about helping us to get Google to be accessible, and it's certainly a lot more accessible than it used to be. Is it perfectly accessible? Well, no, not yet, but we are still working on it, and we started with the proposition in the 1970s that we wanted to get pieces of information, especially the ones that were very important for us right then, and so we developed certain programs to do it. In the next couple of decades, or the next 25 years or so, we changed. And we decided that we wanted all information that everybody else has available all of the time. And we want it with the same ease of use, the same speed, at the same time, in the same quantity, and with the same value that everybody else gets. And we started in the 1990s demanding that, since we're going all digital, and digital is just based upon computer programming, and the computer programming at its essential level is always the same. There are lots of algorithms you use with it, but the machine systems that are read at the machine level are always made out of these zeros and ones. Since we've done that, we have some quantum computing that has come to be developed that now says you have 3 states instead of 2, not either on or off, but on or off, and both on or off at the same, on and off at the same time. And there's a little trouble with quantum computing, but we're going to get access to that information too. Our ideas about what we deserve to have come to be different from what they used to be. We used to say we need to have access to certain pieces of information. Now we say we're not satisfied unless we have it all. And that means all at the same time, with the same value, without much more trouble in getting it than you have to get it. If you can get it, we should be able to get it, and there ought not to be any discrimination in the method of getting at it. So
Karen Anderson has left the meeting.
Our plans to pursue the kinds of employment that we want, the kinds of study that we want, the kinds of participation that we want, they have become vastly more inclusive than they were in 1971. And so you see the change in the price of gold indicates the change in the demand for information, and it indicates the change in the size of the quantity of the information that we have. In other words, it's a great symbol of how we have changed and how we have helped to develop the kind of world that is going to have more access to more information for everybody than we used to have. And the techniques we use as blind people to get at it, the reading machine and all of that, the dictating devices and all that, all of these things that started out as a specialized technology for us, they're making the world much more accessible to everybody, including us. And when they modify it to be used by the sighted, we are not prepared to be left out. All of that is part of what we've done in the last 50 years. Now, it is not by any means all of what we've done, but it is a great piece of how we've changed and how the change that we've made in what we expect and how we hope to be and how we plan to live and how we intend to share the kind of access systems that we build so that other people can get as much access as we can. All of that has helped to make the world a much better place. And we started with the proposition that somebody had to change something for us. Now we say that we will help to develop systems for everybody. And you'll look at the voting machines, for example. Used to be that there were specialized groups that were privileged to vote. And they got the right to vote, but everybody else had to fight for their chance. You can figure out who the everybody else might be. But we were part of the everybody else. We were told, number one, that we couldn't vote, that it wouldn't be proper for us to vote. And then we were told we could vote if we would take an election judge with us. And then we were told that we had to take an election judge from each party with us. And then we fought for the right to take whoever we wanted with us. And then we said, and not only that, you're going to digital, and we want these digital systems to be able to present this information to us at the same time and in the same place and with the same amount of information as they present it to everybody else. And in as much as it's going to be digital anyway, and there are a lot of groups that are going to use the digital system, we want to be part of that. So we now have the right to be able to vote in every federal election all over America. And we're going to get it, that is to say, the right to vote in every election before we're done. That is a fundamental constitutional right. We have always said that the Constitution protects us as much as it protects anybody else. The courts have been very slow to recognize this constitutional right, but we're helping them get there. And many changes have been made in the recognition of the right of we who have disabilities to be in places of public accommodation, to participate in our court systems, to participate in government and so forth. We have changed what we intend to get. And by changing that, we have enhanced our possibility for doing this, but also enhanced the possibilities for lots of other groups as well. In other words, the plans we've made to go forward and to build something new have meant that we can help people know how to make the world a better, a safer, a more fun, a more enjoyable, and a more inclusive society than it was before. You take this car we built, you know, we decided that there was no reason that you couldn't build one that the blind could use. I was sitting around my office one day thinking about what we were going to do with our new building. We were in the process of building our new building. We're going to have a grand opening. And I thought, what shall we put into this grand opening? And I thought of a bunch of things that I know we can build. We just haven't done it yet, but we'll know how to do it some one of these days, and we'll build them and we'll talk about it. And then I thought, and why is it that we're not using these automobiles that everybody loves so much in the US? And I thought, because people have gotten the idea that you have to look out the window. Now, why in the world do you have to look out the window? You have to look out the window because the systems are built so that you can't get the information any other way. Why are they built that way? Well, they're built that way because it was convenient in the past. But now the cars work faster than they used to. They travel farther than they used to. And as a matter of fact, they kill people more often than they used to. Why do we go to this old system? There's a wheel in the car and you steer the car using a wheel. Why do you use a wheel? Well, you use a wheel because that's the way they used to do it on shipboard. Is a ship a good way to develop a car? Don't know whether it is or not, but that's the old system was. You used a wheel to determine which direction you were going to go. And I thought to myself, there's no reason you have to look out the window. All you have to do is get enough information to know what to do. And if you can get it in real time, fast enough, if you can get it right now, we ought to be able to do this. So I proposed this to my friends in the Federation. And they said, what, have you lost your mind? And I thought, well, I don't think so. Let's see if we can get this worked out. And we got some engineers to help us do it. And it's been quite a while back now, I think, wait, 9 years or something. We put it on the track at Daytona and showed people that it could be done. Now we're not done doing it, but part of the process of this was to develop a system that gathered information from outside the car and that developed methods for interpreting it inside the car in some way. And we used 3 computers to analyze this information. Nowadays, the car companies, all of them, anyway, all of the major ones are working on systems similar to the ones we had. We had 25 sensors on the outside of our car. And if you look at the current cars, these are automobiles that drive themselves nowadays. They have algorithms built into their computers, and they have between 16 and 25 sensors on the outside. So the gathering of information is approximately the same as it was all those years ago. There are some systems used that are not too common. LiDAR is one of them. And it's a variant of a radar system. And I mean, there are lots of different ways to gather information, but even the cameras that are being used are not that high tech. So you can build this system without having to develop a lot of new technology, except that you've got to know how to develop the computer systems that analyze the data and determine how to use it. And they all say that it's better if the cars talk to each other.
Ashley Chamberlain has left the meeting.
Why do they need to talk to each other? Well, if they talk to each other, they won't run into each other, because you can build the program so that the car up there can say, hey, you're getting a little close, you know. And then your car can say, oh, yeah, yeah. And then they won't run into each other. Now, that's one of the systems. And all of that we have developed in the past is going to be used as part of the development of the current programs to build the automobiles of the future that will make driving safer than it is today and more usable for more people than it has ever been. And we're going to be a part of this. Now, the car companies aren't going to come to this easily. We're going to have to make them do it. I speculated back when I was giving a speech in Australia, saying if you can build a car that you can drive without having to look out the window, is it discriminatory not to build it? And I think the answer is that it is. I think if you can do it, one of the options has to be to build it that way. And of course, a lot of states now have adopted legislation which says that the car companies can use automated automobiles in those states. And there's federal legislation that comes up from time to time, and we pursue it, which includes provisions that say you can't discriminate in giving out driver's licenses against people who are going to use the cars non-visually, which we keep inserting into the legislation to try to make sure that the states and the car companies recognize our right to park. All of this is part of what we do. What else do we do? Well, we develop our families so that we can come together and have the joy of
Karen Anderson has left the meeting.
having the family experiences
Karen
that other
Anderson has joined
people
the
have
meeting.
taken for granted for so long, that have been denied to blind people for so long. Patricia Maurer and I are both blind people, and we have children. And when I first came to the Federation in 1969, there were some differences in the style of what we did, although the purposes weren't different, but the style of how we did it was different. You would see people walking through the hotel, and there'd be a sighted person in the front of the line. And on the shoulder of that sighted person would be the hand of a blind person. And on the shoulder of that blind person was the hand of another blind person. And there'd be long trains of people who got around that way. Is that a bad way to get around? No, but it means that you don't have quite as much independence as if you pick up your cane in your hand and walk around independently from others and figure out your way without having somebody guide you all the time. And there weren't any children in the convention, or very few. Most blind people didn't have children, because the idea that it was manageable although we talked about it some, it was not common. Nowadays, when you go to the convention, there are parents of blind children all over the place. There are lots of blind kids. There are blind parents with sighted kids. They're all over the place too. There are just a whole group of people who are developing family relationships, jobs, employment opportunities, ways to do things that we've never known in the past. We have a much broader reach in our minds now than we've ever had before. And we've developed it in the last 50 years. And we've raised the price tag from $35 to over $1,900. We've done it also in Nebraska. You may have noticed some of the reports from today. One of the reasons that we have an independent commission for the blind with an independent board is so that blind people can get at the board. Carlos is the director over there, and the board hires him. It gives him his marching orders. And if he doesn't do right by the blind, then we can get at the board and we can say to the board, have you noticed he's not doing what he's supposed to do? He's supposed to do this and this and this. The law says he's supposed to help blind people get training. The law says he's supposed to help blind people get employment, and so on. And he's not doing it. Why isn't he doing it? And what are you going to do about it? And the board will have to say, gosh, we'll have to look into that. So it will encourage Carlos to do right by the blind of Nebraska. Now, he wants to do right by the blind of Nebraska. There's no doubt about it. He came and talked to us about his projection for the future and his wish to participate with all the blind people in the state and to be the kind of director that is going to make a difference in the way that programs are built there. But knowing that somebody can get at the board and help him to get the right kind of opinion in his mind will keep him from forgetting all of this. Now, he wouldn't forget it, but of course, somebody might sometime. So we need to have an independent board so that we can get the kind of program developed in Nebraska that we need. And if we want to develop new opportunities, how are we going to do it? Are we going to have people go into the sciences in ways that we haven't done in the past? I know that we've had blind people who have been chemists in the past, and I can name some people who are teaching chemistry and who are doing chemical work. And I know that we've had some blind people who have been in the veterinary schools in the past, but not very many of them, almost none. And I only know of one who has come to be a pharmacist. Why don't we have more people doing it? And I start looking at the legal decisions that come out. I work on the law all the time. And I look at the legal decisions that come out, and do they recognize the talent of people with disabilities? Well, no, they don't. Mostly they categorize people with disabilities as people who need help. And I think to myself, why don't they categorize people with disabilities as people who have things, who can help others who have contributions to make? But the judges don't know this. So we need to get more people into the judiciary who are blind, who understand the nature of blindness and in a broader sense, the nature of disability. There are so many challenges that we have to meet as an organization and as individuals, and we have to support each other so that we can, but we do that. And this is why we build our organization and why 50 years later, we have many more chances to develop a thriving society with us in it than we did when we started. It's a joy to be back with you in Nebraska, and I wish it were in person, but I'm glad to be here the way we are. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.